What happened to you when you were young that you didn't understand until years later? When I was about 4 or 5 we got 2 very important life-changing bits of medical news. The first was my baby brother was on the way. The second was that my father was diagnosed with acute lymphoma and had about 2 weeks to live. When I was little I had no grasp of how serious cancer was. My mom told me my dad was sick, but that was about it. I remember my mom kept insisting that I spent time with him, but I would always get angry when he got too tired to play or kicked me out so he could vomit from the chemo. I remember one night in particular where my school had my first back to school night/carnival. They had all sorts of rides and stuff. My dad had just had extensive surgery and had staples across his entire neck. I used to joke that he was like Frankenstein. My dad managed to make it through the big presentation the teacher made to the whole class and their parents, but barely. I thought this was boring, but would be worth sitting through, because I would get to go on carnival rides afterwards. But my dad had to leave. He couldn't even stand up. I could not understand how my strong 6 feet 4 inch father could be so selfish. If he could sit through the boring part, why not the good part? I to this day feel tremendously guilty over how I treated him and the tantrum I threw when my mom was struggling to hold my dad up and my dad was struggling just to stay conscious. Fortunately the doctors were wrong. He made it well past the 2 weeks and eventually beat cancer 5 years later. It took years before I understood how seriously sick he really was. He had gotten down to 90 pounds, but to me, he was still a superman. I had reoccurring dreams of crying in the tub while someone threw water in my face from a very young age. I told my mom about it in my teenage years, and she told me that I had been rapped by my babysitter's older son while being given a bath when I was 2. Sad story, but I feel pretty disconnected from that whole experience. It just feels like a bad dream. Edit. Thank you for all the support and questions. Do your research on child care providers and don't be afraid to seek help if you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual abuse. Take care. Edit 2. There seems to be a lot of people who think my mom is an ass for telling me, but I already clarified that it was information that I pressed her for. She was pretty torn about telling me. She started by saying it wasn't a dream and I pressed her for more info, and she told me everything. She asked how I felt afterward and even offered to take me to my therapist again. There was no bluntness about it, but she tried to make it as clinical and straightforward as she could. That traumatic event wasn't just hard for me, but her as well, and so talking about it between the two of us as adults was actually relieving to both of us. When I was 12, my divorced mother and I lived in a nice duplex in my hometown. She would go to the city after I fell asleep and party downtown with my aunt almost every night. I didn't know this until I was older. One night in particular, I fell asleep on the couch and halfway woke up to the sound of the front door opening and closing. I saw my mom walk in with a creepy, hooded, shadowy figure close behind her. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I asked my mom who was with her when she came home last night. She looked terribly confused. I told her about the figure behind her, and the color drained out of her face, and she shook her head and told me to stop playing games. That if I kept telling ghost stories I would invite malevolent spirits into the house. Found out like a year ago that she brought a guy home and made me believe it was a ghost so I wouldn't tell my grandparents. Crafty Beach. TLDR, my mother brought a guy home one night and let me believe for over 10 years that I had seen a ghost. When I was a teenager, my father was the biggest jerk who ever walked the face of the earth. He never bought me video games for my birthday or Christmas, and I had to put almost all of my money I got from gifts and summer jobs into the infamous college fund. We were the last family on the block to get a touch-tone telephone, a computer, a printer, a new television, and to this day, he still has a push mower for the lawn and a television without cable channels, and he doesn't have high-speed internet. While other kids got to sleep in until noon on the weekends, I was always forced to get up at the crack of dawn and work on fixing something that was broken or needed maintaining. There was always something that needed working on during the weekend. The roof needed to be cleaned. The house needed painting. The trees needed to be trimmed. The sidewalk needed to be swept. The kitchen and bathroom needed to have plumbing work done and tiles replaced. And the whole house was always dust, dirty, and in need of cleaning. I felt poor, overworked, and all my friends got their summers and weekends free to do whatever they wanted. Life was so unfair. Now I'm an adult, living on my own away from my parents. I'm still not fond of those childhood memories, but I also didn't have to take out a loan for college. I never worried about paying for college, field trips, gas, food, payments on a house, insurance, or clothes. Money just wasn't an issue for the essentials. I just missed out on some luxuries as a kid. I didn't get to be lazy during the summer of the weekends, but in the last few weeks, I've been able to replace the garbage disposal, paint the back wall, put in new ground cover in the backyard, fix a broken drawer, and a number of other things. I learned all those things from my father, and I had enough money to pay for all those repairs without a second thought, because he taught me the value of money for years and years. He seems like less of a jerk to me now than when I was younger. Edit. Added a picture for the curious. My dad was a fairly strict guy, military background, very type A, etc. I was a very outdoorsy tomboy of a girl. As a kid I loved to find caterpillars and build them little homes, and find the best flowers for them to eat, and my dad loved this hobby of mine. So much so, he would encourage my caterpillar hunting, which I always though seemed a little weird, but I didn't question it. There were a few plants out by our barbecue in the back that he specifically asked me to keep an eye on, because, as he told it to me, this was the best place to find them. My kid brain just though my dad and I had found a common ground, and that he wanted to help. About 5 years later, as my naiveness started to wear off, I realized my dad was a total pothead. My brother, who is 10 years older than me, was chatting with me about my new realization one day, and that's when it was finally spelled out for me. Those plants that according to my pops were the best place to find my footed worm friends were actually just my dad's pot plants, and he enlisted my help to keep them bug free. TLDR, my dad encouraged me to hunt caterpillars off his pot plants. I just though he was trying to help me find the coolest bugs to play with. Everything here is so down and dismal. Let's talk about some happy memories. When I was young, think 4 to 8, I idolized my brothers. Jack was the mature father figure with all the brains. Ben was the looks and the cool guy. And Peter was the rebel without a cause. Jack went to college when I was 4. It was hard to grip as a kid that I was losing my best friend. I didn't understand why he had to leave home to go to school when he used to just come home every day. Whenever he visited though, he always took time to goof around with me. My dad wasn't exactly capable of being fatherly, due in large part to alcohol, but he was around. Jack was basically my father figure growing up, and through him, I learned what it meant to be a good dad. He made time for me, even if it was just to fuck off and play video games for a whole day. He taught me some essential stuff like how to fish and how to be successful. I didn't realize it at the time, but he's the one who taught me how to be a man. My brother Ben was very much the same to a lesser extent though. He spent a lot of his time playing music, talking to girls, and playing video games. When my brother left, he took up the mantle of the father figure. He'd take me out to the mall, but we always wound up coincidentally meeting up with girls he knew. They'd gush over me. Hey, I was a damned handsome kid with baby blue eyes. Who can blame them? I watched my brother talk with them and take them around and show them a good time. I thought I was part of the gang. Nope. My brother was using me as a chick magnet, and through that I unknowingly learned to flirt and how to treat a girl. Ben also taught me how to chill like a fucking pimp. We'd kick back, listen to some music, giggle like idiots at Ren and Stimpy, and play Legos for faking hours. He had a dog whistle on his keychain. I could never get it to make a noise when I blew on it, so I thought little of it. He'd clean that thing religiously after he went on walks. Without me, he needed some alone time, and right after he cleaned it was when we would goof around. We always had snacks. He taught me that when cups are dirty, the next best option was to use a bowl instead. I thought he was so cool. About 2 years ago, out of nowhere, I remembered that dog whistle he had on his keychain. With the wisdom that could only be granted through age and a college degree in Maine, I deduced that dog whistle was, in fact, a pipe. He used to smoke weed on his walks. He was just extremely high for most of my childhood, as it turns out. Then there's Peter. I stick to what I said. He was a faking rebel without a cause. I'm talking dyed blue punk spikes. He looked like a character out of SLC Punk. One time, he got in trouble for drinking cranberry juice in the hallway. The student government kids could drink in the halls at their booths, so why can't he drink in the hallways? Well, the man came crashing down on him and slapped him with a solid sentence of 5 days of hard labor and in-school suspension. Peter dealt with it exactly like how a mature adult wouldn't. He bought a prison jumpsuit, dyed his hair neon orange, put chains around his wrists, and went into the exile like a political revolutionary icon of the proletariat school body. I thought it was faking hilarious at the time, but when I got to his age I felt the same way he did. Not everyone was treated the same, and it wasn't fair. I learned from Peter how not to deal with authority, though, so I joined the student senate and fought the man from the inside. Anyways, a lot of stuff happened when I was a kid that I didn't understand until later. It never occurred to me that was all just Jack showing me how to be a man, Ben showing me how to enjoy life, or Peter showing me how to navigate a society I didn't like. I'm sitting here as a semi-successful person today because of them, and everything I learned just by being around them. Oh, and one time I got scratched by a wildcat. I thought it was just a dick, and that all animals love me. Nope, I didn't realize it at the time, but it's a law of nature that cats hate me. Edit. First off, thanks for the gold, Mystery Redditor and you/Zielsen. And for those wondering how my brothers fared in life after adolescence, Jack graduated college after switching majors. He pulled a straight 180 and went from anthropology to molecular biology, where he kicked so much as it's hard to explain. He's now a PhD and just accepted a professorship. He married a wonderful woman who makes magic cookies which live up to their name. Those things are God's gift to men. They're expecting their first child in January. I'm so fucking excited. What a boring, absurdly successful life path. Ben had a rough time in college. When I say that, I mean he partied way too hardy and forgot to go to most of his classes. After going before the end of his third semester, he moved back in with my parents. He dated some crazy girl who looked like she would have hung out with Peter in his heydays. It didn't work out. Ben went back to school where he obsessively did not screw up. I don't use that term lightly. He retook some classes because he only got a B. I remember once when he was the ladies man lacrosse player in high school, a girl, Jen, used to follow him around all the time. They were friends, but outside of school he avoided her like the plague from what I could tell. She frequently had me go fetch him while I rode my bike around our block. He would pretend he wasn't home, and so she resorted to calling, knowing my mother would pick up the phone and force him to talk to her. Except he often pawned the phone off onto me when my mom felt satisfied in her giddy eavesdropping. I very distinctly remember her telling me she had green toenails. That was so goddamn disgusting, even to nose-picking 6-year-old me. I understood why Ben didn't want to hang around her. Gangrene is gnarly. I guess because he totally didn't like her at all, ever. They got in a little tiff before graduation and stopped talking. Fast forward several years, Ben happens to see Jen at a bar. In a valiant effort to make up for lost time/relive his glory days, he goes up to talk to her. Without warning, Jen freaks out that this ghost from her past came back to haunt her, and she blurts out the magic words that scared most men away. I have a kid. It failed miserably, so she was forced to retreat. My brother, probably hearing that sad Peanuts song in his head, sauntered away until one of Jen's friends intercepted him and gave him her number. This time I had nothing to do with the phone calls, so they progressed from calling each other to hanging out. Suddenly my mom is babysitting Jen's daughter, and a couple years later he proposed. Jen's daughter doesn't have green toes, nor does Ben and Jen's daughter, Erin. I assume green toes are not hereditary. Jen insists she must have painted her toes green, and I just misunderstood. Doubtful. Peter carried on his rebel attitude after his hair grew out into a less absurd shade of brown. My mom was happy. Peter was cranky, but considering he decided not to go to college and support the banking industry through student loans, motherfucker needed a job. I guess he wound up deciding that the best way to fight Big Brother was to pay taxes and vote. Over time he became less and less punk and frankly became far more enjoyable to be around. At Jack's bachelor party he saved 17-year-old me from looking like a gargantuan jackass by stopping me when I thought I could pick up an entire party of sorority girls while being sloppy drunk and chewing on a cigar in the middle of a campsite. No lulz cakes. You don't talk to girls when you're this drunk. Sage advice. Over time, he went full poser and decided to live his punk lifestyle vicariously through this bit of corporate propaganda. He now wears pastel-colored polo shirts, rocks an almost military haircut, and carries his bouncing 2-year-old twins in both arms, both of whom shake their butts to Tim Armstrong, so maybe Peter will end up teaching them everything he knows about gluing their hair into spikes and mohawks. When I was a little kid, we had a kid in our class named George who was mentally retarded. We had special needs kids in our school, and we wouldn't have them in the same class, but they would share recess with the rest of the kids. George dressed funny, he couldn't speak very well, and he had a hard time understanding what we were telling him. As you might imagine, this led to a lot of the kids excluding him or making fun of him. My friends and I decided to be his friend. He was a nice kid, didn't mean any harm. He was just a bit slow. Years later, in telling the story to someone else, I remembered my teacher explaining that he was Greek, which I didn't understand at the time. Thinking about it, I remembered that just like the special needs kids, the ESL kids shared recess with us. George wasn't retarded. He was just a recent immigrant from Greece who didn't speak English very well. Edit. Removed a typo. I hope I'm not late to the party. When I was about 6 to 7, wish I was looking for bugs in my backyard. When I came across a super rare and badass praying mantis, naturally I scooped it up and put it in my bug container. Later on I was looking for more bugs when I found yet another praying mantis. Lucky day. I was super excited and put it in the container with the other praying mantis. Both of them stood in there dead still and just kind of bobbed around like praying mantis do. I came back a few hours later and was appalled by what I found. The bigger mantis standing there as still as ever right on top of a praying mantis head and legs. I was super spooked. Was that mantis a killer? Did the smaller mantis fall apart or explode? What happened? It really weirded me out for a while. I'd say about 10 or so years later I found out that the female mantis eats the male after sex. I still don't know if I'm an accomplice to a murderer or a world-class wingman. I'm 24 years old now, and I didn't really realize what happened to my sister and I until about a year ago. We had a neighbor named Bob. Bob was in his 60s with a wife that was very ill. Bob was a nice man who had to take care of his wife who was pretty much dying. My mom trusted Bob, my sister trusted Bob, I trusted Bob. Bob would play games with us. We loved Bob. He would let us come over to his house once his wife was out for the evening. He would let us come over in the afternoon if his wife was asleep. Bob started playing a game with us called the slide game. My sister was about 5 and I was about 8. Bob's only rule was that we could not wear jeans when playing the game. He always talked about how he preferred soft shorts, like cheer shorts. Girls know. Well, Bob would let us sit on his face and slide down all the way to his lap, over and over again. He would also make a motor sound which to us made it more fun. He would breathe hot breath on us as well when we were on his mouth. I honestly didn't even realize this was bad in any way. My mom put a collage together for me a year ago, including a picture of Bob standing with my sister and I. A few memories flooded my head, and I was happy until I thought about this game and about how he literally molested my sister and I without us or my parents knowing. Children are too innocent. My parents' divorce. My mother suffers from bipolar disorder, and 20 plus years ago the psychiatric community was fragmented in terms of how to properly medicate it. Without proper medication and good access to mental health, my mother was not only suicidal and constantly depressed, but she had a bad spending habit. During her bouts of mania, She would go on shopping sprees to the tune of $10,000 to $20,000, buying all kinds of useless shit we didn't need and couldn't afford. She'd put it all on credit cards. There were quite a few times growing up that I recall my dad loading bags and bags of shit into his pickup truck and carting my brother and me to the mall and standing in line for hours returning the stuff. When my dad finally had enough, he committed my mother and then filed for divorce. She'd threatened to kill herself if he ever left her. For many years I had a great deal of animosity towards my dad because I thought he had abandoned mom when she needed him the most. He did everything in his power to try and help her. Not that she didn't want the help, but nobody he took her to could get her on the right medication. I was well into my 20s before realizing he made the decision he thought was best for me and my brother, though he made a lot of mistakes on his own, too. I guess I came to the understanding that my dad didn't want to take the chance that my mother's illness would cause irreparable damage to us. I never understood that not everyone had people drop bags of groceries on their steps while the people just rang the bell and drove away. Dawned on me as an adult that we were poor. Then I looked back at old pics and noticed all the signs. Tiny Christmas tree in the background, disappointed faces on Christmas pics, no vacation pictures. Damn it. I'm gonna try to avoid having my kids live that way. The other part of that is I didn't realize how stressed my mom always was until I got older and realized not everyone's parents freaked out weekly and slammed doors and peeled off in their car leaving their kids alone and scared. I specifically remember one incident where my mom, brother and I went to the grocery store and while we were walking to the car my mom dropped the gallon of milk and it exploded all over the ground. My mom started crying and my brother said, "Don't cry over spilt milk mom," kinda chuckling. I didn't understand at all. Now looking back it hurts me to think how hard my mom was trying to keep everything together. She passed away at age 51 when I was 18. She had a rough adulthood. I lived my life now hoping to become what she wanted me to be. She made tons of mistakes, but she was there for me on her own, and she tried so hard. All you teens, take notice of how your parents act when they think you're not looking. You might be surprised to find they are very stressed and working super hard to make you happy, oftentimes with only frustration to show for it. I didn't really understand the implications of 9/11 at the time. I was 11, but I sometimes wonder if my lack of empathy was from my age or from some other psychological issue. Edit. Words edit. Since everyone is sharing their stories, I will share mine. I rode my bike to school for the first time ever that day. There was a patch of dirt in the woods out back with ramps the kids built. I did some shitty tricks then went into school. My dad came to school to tell me he left work early and he told me what happened. I asked if that meant I could go home early and he said no. Later, the principal came into the class and I was just excited that I already knew what he was going to say. When I got out of school, my bike tire had been slashed. I had that gel anti-flat stuff in there, so it was a mess. I walked to the pizza shop around the corner and the footage was on the TV behind the register. The guy working the register was a dick and refused to take my gold dollar because it wasn't real currency. They were new then. I called my mom and went home. I was given a note to take home from my private kindergarten. The note informed my family that I was no longer welcomed at the school and for me never to return there. I was then enrolled in a public school kindergarten. It wasn't until several years later that I found out that I was kicked out of that kindergarten because my father was arrested by the FBI and sent to an internment camp shortly after WWII started because he was a leader in Hawaii's Japanese community in his service as a volunteer liaison between the family's Buddhist temple and new immigrants from Japan to Hawaii. I found out about this when my father finally returned to the family a year after the end of the war, when my mother told him about all that transpired in his absence. Edit. That last sentence was wishful thinking on my part as my mother was very ill and died before my father returned from internment. What she did do was maintained and documented each of her offspring's day-to-day activities, keeping all of our school paperwork, our report cards, our health reports. Everything and anything she could do to compile our life's existence during our dad's absence. My dad went through all this stuff late at night when he thought that we were all in bed asleep. I would get up at times and watch him without his seeing me and would get so sad to see him wipe tears from his eyes from time to time. I developed a sense of outrage that our government would bring so much hurt to my family. Maybe not as dramatic as a lot of the things here, but I was gaslighted and abused for many years in my childhood. A lot of it was by my stepmother. When I was younger, my stepbrother would grab me and throw me against the wall, hit me, punch me, kick me, until I bruised severely. He'd threaten me. I finally realized I was sick of it, and I went to the school counselor and showed her the bruises, but my dad had the excuse of, "Oh, she's always falling down. Her stepbrother did nothing to her." Funnily enough, I was in the early stages of cerebellar ataxia at the time, and I also have a genetic disorder that makes me bruise very easily and can mess with proprioception. Wasn't diagnosed until this year. Go figure. I was probably 10 at the time, but it had been going on for 4/5 years. Me going to the counselor resulted in an absolute shitstorm. My father pretty much told me he didn't want me in his house until he figured out what to do with me, and my mother took the abuse as a manipulation point. I eventually went back over there, and my stepmother and my father sat me down for a little chat. A chat that lasted 3 hours. They screamed at me the entire time, and they told me how horrible of a person I was, and how I just wanted to screw everyone's lives up. I clearly remember my stepmother saying, "You're just like your mother. You're a terrible person." Remember, I was 10. If you couldn't guess, nothing really came of me going to the counselor. My father came up to the school, and he had a tape recorder in his pocket. Yep. He saved his job as a police officer before he'd even consider worrying about me. Classic him. That year, I realized just how depressed I was. That summer, I began considering suicide. I was cutting myself. I know Reddit doesn't have a lot of sympathy for that, but it's so screwed up that at the age of 10, I wanted nothing more than death. I stopped cutting myself about 2 years later, as I realized my skin doesn't heal very well. I wasn't a dumb kid. I knew where not to cut and how deep to cut. My translucent skin really helps with that. I'm known to be intelligent. Freakishly intelligent. For many parents, this would be a point of pride. For my mother, it is. For a while, that's the only thing about me that mattered. For my father and my stepmother, it's an embarrassment. Girls aren't supposed to be smart. This year, I was finally diagnosed with a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It explains a lot of my health problems, really. Then I was diagnosed with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, then Shire malformation, and now cerebellar ataxia. It's been a shitty year. But I advocated for 2 years before being diagnosed W/AIDS. I'm in severe pain every day. My balance is so bad. I can barely walk. If someone had listened, I wouldn't be dealing with the possibility that I might be in a wheelchair in a few years. Let's add medical neglect to the list. And, yes, both parents are guilty of this one. This year, my stepmother said, "You're a faking sociopath. There's no humanity in your head. It's all numbers. You're just a machine. That's all you are." Years of this faked me up. I began questioning if I was even real. I began feeling like an emotional zombie. Gaslighting at its finest. My mother is pretty bad too. She's an alcoholic. She's manipulative and verbally abusive. She calls me a cripple, tries to get me to pity her for having a crippled daughter, etc. But she's all I have. On the other hand, my father never tried to have a relationship with me, but just loves my older sister. We have a huge rift between us. Funny thing, my older sister stormed out of the house 3 weeks ago, and I haven't talked to her since. She was telling me how bad of a daughter I am, how undeserving I am, etc. I told her to leave if she loved my father that much, and she did. As she left, she called me a faking worthless cripple. Also, my stepbrother is a juvenile delinquent with multiple offenses spread out over a few years, and was at the time he was abusing me. Yet, they still believed him. It leaves a bitter taste in my mouth, considering I'm the most respectful, most intelligent, and I have the most potential out of any of the kids. And one more thing. When I was 6, my stepmother chopped off all of my hair because, since I was smart and liked video games, I must be a boy, right? That one has created a bit of trauma. She now insists that since I'm sick, my talents are wasted. I'm glad I realized that I was constantly being dehumanized and degraded. I'm glad I cut off most connections. I'm still miserable, but things are looking up. Are things great when my mother? Hell no. I'm just counting the days until I get out. TLDR, stepmother is an alcoholic and manipulative and dehumanizes me because of my intelligence. Father is totally apathetic towards me. Mother is also an alcoholic, manipulative, verbally abusive person, but she's a bit better. Stepbrother physically abused me for many years until I got help, but it exposed me to more mental abuse. I became suicidal, and I'm still trying to recover as I'm dealing with my disability. I try to make the best of it. When I about 8, I was using my parents' bathroom and picked up a hand towel by the sink and a plastic penis fell out. I already knew what a penis was since my siblings, and I had watched the hilarious Where Did I Come From? Sexual education video narrated by Howie Mandel. I thought this plastic penis was hilarious, and when my little sister was taking a shower, I poked it in through the shower curtain and would poke her with it. She thought it was pretty funny too. Our mom was horrified to find us playing with it, and when we asked what it was for, she said it was for medical purposes and studying. We were never able to find it again. It wasn't until a few years ago when my sister and I were reminiscing about stupid things we did as children that I remembered this incident and told her, "Oh my god, we played with mom's dildo." TLDR, found my mom's dildo and joked around with it. Sister and I didn't realize until about 15 years later what it was. When I was younger my house was messy and my mum only ever cleaned on special occasions, and that was only certain rooms people were allowed in. I always thought this was completely normal. We had wine boxes holding up our couch and shoved right up our chimney, which was covered by a fire screen. Our kitchen smelled of mold and rotting food. The benches and floors were covered in the source of the smell and other unidentifiable objects. My clothes used to sit in a washing basket so long after they were washed that they would start to grow fuzz. There was one room beside mine which was so overpacked with rubbish and toys that I could barely crack the door open. It was just filthy overall. No one ever saw this though, and if they did I can only imagine that my mum would have lost custody of me immediately, and I think she knew that. I lived like that until I was 12, and I didn't really understand what was happening until recently when watching an episode of Hoarders. It's kind of messed me up. I can't sleep unless my house is spotless, and I constantly have panic attacks if I forget to clean something before leaving the house. My mom had a serious drug problem my entire life. When I was in high school, I recognized the alcohol addiction that was new and developed when I entered high school. In college she developed an obvious addiction to painkillers, which killed her when I was 19. I was talking to my dad, and he told me that her drug problems was the main reason for their divorce, and why he fought so hard for custody yet still remained so friendly with my mom to be a prominent figure in my life. I was confused, because to me my mom's issues didn't start until I entered high school and she discovered alcohol, and my dad mentioned that he was talking about a heroin addiction my entire childhood. He didn't realize, when he said it, that I was unaware of it, and he was incredibly upset that he told me that when I didn't know. He hated the idea of hurting my memory of my mom, who, despite her massive fuck-ups, I still love. She was my mom. Even looking back now, I'm a bit shocked to learn all this, but it makes a lot of things make sense.